Hi, welcome to my Growing Tomatoes for Beginners series. Whether you're buying starts or growing from seed, you could be wondering which tomato variety should I grow this year? This is what we're going to answer today, and if you stick around to the end, I have a bonus tip for you. Let's get started. When we are deciding which variety to grow, we look at the tag of the seed start or the description on the back and the front of the seed packet. And we'll look for three key pieces of information, and we'll see together how each one of those will affect our decision. Let's start by the tomato size. Tomatoes can be cherries, paste, or slicers. How would that affect our decision? Well, you can imagine the amount of nutrition taken to grow this fruit would be less than this and less than the slicers. And slicers actually can grow up to be over 1 pound. If you're growing in containers, it means you'll have to water more often, you will have to fertilize more often, and even then you might still not be able to get the full potential of a slicer. Also, a slicer will need a lot more sun. If you're growing on a balcony or you have trees shading your yard and you cannot get the full 13 hours of sun, then you might do better growing something that's a bit smaller. Now, the second key piece of information that we will consider would be whether the plant is determinant or indeterminate. Determinant plants get to a predetermined height. They set their flowers and their fruits all around the same time, between few weeks to a month, and then they die back. Indeterminate tomatoes can grow on and on and on, and if you have a mild winter climate, you can actually overwinter tomato and grow them over several years. They can easily get to 10 or 20 feet. Let's take a look at some examples and see how being an indeterminate or a determinant will affect our choice. So, most of your cherries and your slicers are actually indeterminate tomatoes. If you have an indeterminate cherry tomato, you can grow it in a 5-gallon container or larger, and of course you can grow it in the ground. However, you will need to figure out how to trellis an indeterminate tomato when it gets to be 10 or 20 feet high. For indeterminate tomatoes that are slicers, the bigger ones, they need at least a 10-gallon container if you're not growing them in the ground. Also, you will need to figure out how to trellis it. Now, there is a difference between those in terms of pruning, which is something that we will talk about later. Just to give you a hint now, indeterminate tomatoes, the bigger ones, they need to be pruned. However, with cherry tomatoes and indeterminate, you let them bush out, which means they need less time of you taking care of them. Another factor to consider with the indeterminate and the determinants will be the days to maturity. If you have a short growing season, you will probably do better with a determinate variety that you will get to harvest all of your fruits before your frost gum. Now, when you talk about determinant, there are usually your regular size determinant like the Roma, and then you also have dwarf varieties. Dwarf varieties are targeted for containers. For example, the Tiny Tim, this one can be grown in a 1-gallon to a 5-gallon container, whereas something like the Roma will enjoy at least a 5-gallon container. Again, as with the cherries, the bigger the container, the more harvest you will get. There is an interesting exception. There is something called the Dwarf Tomato Project, which is targeting balcony growers or urban gardeners who want the benefit of a dwarf variety, but they don't want to harvest all of their fruits at once. For example, there is this one which I will not attempt to pronounce. It's developed in New Zealand, And I will put the link to a website that sells all of their varieties if you're interested in checking those out. Now, our final point that we will talk about will be your heirlooms versus hybrids. And there are a lot of confusion about this. Now, there's a difference between hybrids and GMO. GMO means they are genetically modified. Those will never be sold to consumers. They are very expensive to make, and there are a lot of contracts and legal things entailed with it. So you will never accidentally buy GMO seeds or a GMO start. But hybrids basically means that the pollen from one variety was used to pollinate a different variety. This can happen in nature by bees or other insects, or it can be deliberate by people breeding different varieties together. And this, when you hybridize the plant, the first generation is called an F1. And for example, like the sun gold, now the sun gold is one of the most famous hybrids, as well as the sweet 100 and many others that you will find in the nurseries. Those are bred to be productive, disease resistant, and some of them are even bred for taste. Because hybrids are a cross between two different varieties, the seeds you will collect from those will not always be true to the mother plant. So you have plant A, plant B, you cross them together, you get your F1. If you try to collect seeds from your F1, what you will get will either be like your F1 if you're lucky, or it will be like plant A or plant B. If you want to collect your seeds for the future, then you will do better with an open pollinated variety. Now, after a while, those hybrids will stabilize, and many of the heirloom varieties we have now were once hybrids. Now, so open pollinated variety means that if you collect the seed from it, you know that you will get a fruit or a plant that's true to the parent. Heirlooms are open pollinated varieties that have been around for at least 50 to 100 years. So, all heirlooms are open pollinated, but not all open pollinated varieties will qualify as heirlooms. How would that affect your choice? Actually, it's good to have a mix of both. Hybrids, again, they will have better production and better disease resistance. If you are not going to be growing 20 tomato plants and you are only going to have one or two, you might consider the hybrids to make sure that you will get something rewarding at the end of the season. However, if you're interested more in trying unique varieties that you will not otherwise find in the grocery store, it will be fun to try your hands with different open pollinated varieties like the oranges and the yellows and the greens and all of those fun colors and flavors that we don't experience in the grocery store. For those of you who stayed till the end, here is my final tip. Some varieties are developed for specific environments. For example, something like the Floridate tomato is developed for the Florida weather, which is very hot and very humid. On the other hand, there are other varieties that are developed for cold northern regions. And for example, there is another variety called the Arkansas Traveler, which also does very well in hot, humid conditions. If you find varieties that are developed for your region, it most likely will do well for you. And next time, we'll be talking about seed starting in a very simple way for beginners. See you next time.